All right, to start off with this session, let me first uh, set the stage for Tingyi's presentation, which will come after I say a few words. Okay, first, I just would like to say that for the last year and a half, our country has been undergoing a lot of stress, even more so for our Asian American and Chinese American communities. Uh, Basically, what happened is that the COVID-19 pandemic plus the U.S.-China tension brought into focus the eruption of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment. And this sentiment, I believe, was always lurking in the background. And these set of events led to hate incidents and crimes. Now, how do our community respond to it? How does the country respond to this? Um, Here, I just list out a few quick responses. Nationwide, our elected officials in Washington passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that provides some safeguards to safety and protection of Asian communities. And also, at the same time, local communities have been working with enforcement agencies to help identify and prosecute hate crimes directed at Asians. We must, people probably have seen the presentation by San Antonio Lodge yesterday, and they did a great job at working at the grassroots level. And thirdly, we would also like to, as a community, it's the Asian American community, maybe even other communities together, we also like to demand the government to stop or moderate the China initiative policy, which is something that's gathering some momentum to do something about it, because basically the China initiative policy is basically a racial profiling to all of us. Now, as I alluded to before, that I always suspect, and most people will agree with me, there's a lurking, a deep-rooted anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment in this country. It's been ongoing for a long time, and the way to tackle this problem, I think, is by education. Okay, this is a process that might take some time to see tangible results, obvious results, but this is a process that is important and necessary for us all to, in an effort to root out prejudice and discrimination, particularly against the AAPI communities. The first I would like to talk about the education is that educating the general public. How do we do that? There's been a lot of museums with Asian American exhibits telling the Asian American stories, Chinese American stories. For example, here in Los Angeles, we have the Chinese American Museum. And I'm also very happy to have heard that from Grace Mang's talk, that there's a museum based on AAPI history that is in the plans in Washington, D.C. Also, documentaries which are shown in PBS, and even films, even studio production films that present a positive picture of the Chinese American and the Asian American stories. That are also, these are also very, very helpful. But the next I would like to talk about is how do we educating the young. That is, we offer ethnic studies program including these programs should include AAPI content in the K to 12 classrooms. And these studies would tell immigration stories, how these immigrants particularly from Asian Americans and other Asians, how they contribute to the development of America. And on the side, these studies would also afford the space for students to learn cultural sensitivity and cultural competence. Now, actually, many states and local school districts are also getting into the act. Many states and local legislations have been passed to mandate ethnic studies with AAPI content in the K to 12 curricula. However, there are some that have not included AAPI studies. And one interesting thing that happened just a couple of months ago is that the state of Illinois has just passed legislation that requires 1 unit of Asian American studies for a student to graduate from high school. So that is a requirement for graduation. And this is sort of like a pioneer. This is the first state in the United States to do so. And so this is very good news. And this is something that we need to replicate in other states and other local districts. And last but not least, there have been a lot of student activist groups that sprang up nationwide that demanded AAPI studies in public schools curriculums. These are students, activist students who work together with educators in the college level and also in the high school level, together form a force that demand AAPI studies. An example is DAWN, which is called Diversify Our Narrative, which I believe started in California and has branches or chapters all over the country now. The second one that I am aware of is ECAR, ECAAR, which represents Education Coalition for Asian American Representation. This is also a grassroots student organization pushing for AAPI studies in the Seattle area. So as you see, there's a lot of efforts, a lot of interest in promoting AAPI studies in high schools, in public schools. Now, this view graph, I would just like to say that CACA can actually contribute. They have the resources to contribute to K-12 curriculum and lesson development, and also provide materials that can provide an accurate, positive narrative to the Chinese American story. CACA, a lot of CACA members, quite a few CACA members are historians. They have developed good knowledge of Asian American histories in these countries. They are educators among us who are high school teachers or maybe even grade school teachers who had good experience in teaching in that level. And there are also a lot of members who are ready to contribute in this effort in any capacity they can. And CACA also has access to the Alliance's historical documents on fighting discrimination and the stories of Chinese American World War II veterans, which they have collected in the Congressional Gold Medal campaign recently. As indicated by our previous talks, the Alliance also helped fund many documentaries and films and on Asian American topics. And I believe that CAC can get special access to these documentaries and films to be resources for teaching classes. Okay, now, having said that, I would like to now introduce our speaker today. He is Ting-Yi Wei. He's the Education Director of Foundation 1882 Foundation. And he was a curriculum and staff development consultant. He had a career in high school as high school teacher and administrator in the state of Virginia before he retired. And he's also a member of the Washington, D.C. Lodge of CACA. Ting-Yi is going to, in his talk, he's going to focus on the themes and events that will illustrate the importance of making the K-12 curriculum more inclusive. He will make some suggestions on how to construct lessons that are meaningful and meet state standards in multiple ways. So with that, I would like to turn the podium over to Ting-Yi, and there will, okay, by the way, there will be question and answer sessions after the end of Ting-Yi's talk. Okay.
Thank you, Charles.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay.
So if perhaps we can share my screen, that would be good. Are you able to share my screen? Otherwise, I think you've got my slideshow there.
Huh.
I think
Yes.
you need to share your own screen as long as someone has given you permission.
Yeah, I think you did you see the
Yes.
the share screen button?
I'm clicking on it.
You can share.
I'm clicking on it, but I'm not seeing any ability to do that.
Okay.
So we can share for you.
Yeah.
Ray, I think the presentation, let's see if it's in the Google Drive.
Okay, let me yeah, let me
Hold on a second here. So we can wait a minute.
There we go. I think I've got it now.
You got it? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, you got it. Yeah.
All right. So let me start the. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So thank you very much, Charles, for the introduction. And I've just got kind of a broad spectrum here in this introductory slide of things that probably many of you have seen. And as Charles said, my goal here is to really kind of lay out the case for the Foundation for AAPI studies in K through 12 education. So I'll go through the slideshow, please. As we go along here, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat, and I'll try to follow along as we go through too here. And perhaps if I can get some cues from other people like Charles, as you see things appear in the chat as I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me and let me know. So I'd like to start with, because it's so important to work with, I think, state authorities to make sure you can basically make the case for whatever it is you want to include in the state standards. And so I just want to run through some things that are pretty common to it. first of all, their standards generally cover two areas. One is skills. So things like how is it that you synthesize evidence given some documents that you may see or other primary sources, using geographic information, interpreting charts and graphs, constructing arguments, comparing, contrasting. Those are just some of the things that are asked of students to learn throughout the curriculum, throughout K through 12. These are skills that are built upon. So often it's just becomes a question of how do you incorporate content to show those things. Generally speaking, content standards are very broadly written, but most states have very, I shouldn't say very, but have detailed curriculum guides that identify specific subject matter, and then they leave out a lot of times, most of the time, AAPI related history. And therefore our stories are invisible and as a consequence of that, deemed unimportant. So what I'd like to do is try to make sure that we make connections here constantly to different kinds of content that are not currently in there, or if they are, I'll show you here in a bit too, ways in which we can make that content very relevant to individual state standards. For the most part, I'm going to be referring to state standards that reflect Virginia's standards in the social studies, but they're not that much different from state to state. Like I say, they're broadly written. And so the idea is that somehow you can find ways in which to bring in content that fits the standards. So here, this first picture, and I think many of you are familiar with this, though I think for non-Asian Americans, non-Chinese Americans, they may not be so familiar. I know that I never really became familiar with them until I started working closely here with 1882 and beginning to do a lot more research, mainly on my own, to find this. But here we see Chinese miners who are working alongside white miners around 1860. And actually, I think this photograph goes actually a few years back before then. So the question is, does this image fit into the standards? And I would say yes. Expansion is something that is talked about all the time, westward expansion. And it's usually always addressed from the fact that people from the East are moving out west, and particularly after the gold rush. And this is exactly what this is all about. But it's not only people from the American East that are coming over, it's also coming from other places, notably China, who are coming for the same reason, the search for Gold Mountain. So they're coming also, and there's no reason why you can't at least mention the fact there is expansion that's included by this kind of migration that's coming across the Pacific Ocean into the West Coast. So this is a very simple way of trying to introduce into the whole theme of expansion something that it needs to be taught, but why not introduce? In fact, one should introduce the fact that there are Chinese miners coming into the United States at this time. So one of the things that is indeed covered by the standards is the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And there's usually kind of lip service paid to the contribution of Chinese miners. But the picture that you see always is the one showing the meeting of the two locomotives. And that's the one that doesn't have any Chinese in it. So that's, of course, one of the flaws with that. But as you can see from this picture, and that's where these things are, that indeed there are Chinese who are present at the time of it. So trying to get Chinese workers at the front and center of this monumental achievement and transcontinental communication and transportation building is important, and it should be shown in that particular light. And there's so much more, of course, you can go into with that, but it's again something that when you're speaking about transportation, about communication, bridging the gap between East and West in the United States, this is a rather key thing that needs to be addressed right away. And of course, there's another way of looking at this as well. Down in the lower right is the picture of this Corky Lee's picture showing the meeting of the two railroads, but with the descendants of the Chinese railroad workers. So this is another way of just introducing into the discussion the fact that not only were there Chinese building it, but their descendants still live here in the country, and not only live here, but are an important part of the fabric of the United States. I have to the left of that something that appeared in the San Francisco newsletter Mr. Strobridge, who was essentially the foreman for the Central Pacific Railroad as it was moving eastward and worked for Charles Crocker, there's a quote from him in this newsletter that says, that introduced his Chinese workers and really gave them the credit they deserved. They helped to build the road, a tribute they well deserved, and which evidently gave much pleasure to them when they were so recognized. And one of the things that's peculiar about the whole Chinese American and Asian American story is these are the kinds of things that are lost in the telling of it. To just kind of go back for a moment to a couple of things that Baldwin and Larissa mentioned in their presentation. One of the key things here that I was really kind of disappointed in terms of Baldwin's remembering about American history is that he thought, that he didn't like history. And one of the key things we have to do here is convince our students that this is important. Not only is it important, but it's fun and it's something that really is engaging. And so we have to bring the passion to telling the story about it. And one of the things we have to recognize is that most of the teachers in America, of course, are not Asian American. They have no direct connection to this. Teachers don't know what they don't know. So one of the things that I want to try to emphasize here as we go through and a little bit later as we talk about this is the importance of professional development, of training teachers so that they become familiar with a lot of the content that I'm mentioning here, but frankly, teachers don't have a clue about. So how is it we begin to incorporate some of this information and make it relevant really to what they're talking about? Because that's another point that Baldwin made, is how do we make this content really relevant to the experiences that kids have and also to the way the teachers teach about this kind of thing. And one of these things that has, of course, happened in the last year that Charles alluded to, and I'm sure other speakers during the course of the conference have talked about, is the history of anti-Asian feeling, anti-Asian violence. And most notable one, perhaps in the past, prior to a lot of the things that have come to light here in this year, is the massacre in 1871 that took place in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, of course, then is not at all what Los Angeles is now. It was a sleepy town. I believe the population in 1871 was only 6,000 people. And yet there was this Chinese community that was there that, well, for various reasons, the community that was living there already of whites took offense to. And what is generally seen as perhaps the largest single massacre in American history took place there in 1871, and it was covered. People heard about it. It was written about in newspapers across the country, and the Chinese who were victimized filed lawsuits about it and all the rest. People were arrested, but nothing much came of it. So again, it's one of these things where the history is there, but it's been forgotten or hidden, however one wishes to interpret it. I have mentioned down here at the bottom, Chinese fought back in the courts, not just this time, but all the time. And so it's not just a story of victimhood. It really is a story where we try to push the narrative that there are things going on here which Chinese at this particular time reacted too strongly and tried to see if they couldn't get it right. In the public media at the time, there was a good sense that a lot of things that were happening to the Chinese weren't right. Harper's Weekly, some of you may know it. It's Descendant magazine. Harper's is still around. There's not a direct connection between the paper then, or the magazine, the weekly that came out then, and the monthly magazine today. But they stood forth and actually argued quite strongly in editorials, and especially through their political cartoons, most notably by Thomas Nast, that really what was happening to the Chinese was not right. So here you see one that's been used many, many, many times, but America means fair play for all men. This highlights that kind of feeling. This is another example of something that's easy to use by teachers. They can use this as a primary source. They can have students begin to analyze it as they begin to discuss something about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Because the Chinese Exclusion Act, it is indeed mentioned in the standards in most places now. It wasn't always, but in the last few years, there has been some recognition of that. But it's usually mentioned just in the context of an immigration law that keeps Chinese from entering into the country. But it's much more than that. And it has antecedents going back to the massacre, antecedents 10 years before the law ever becomes a law, and showing the kinds of feelings that were beginning to occur in the United States at that particular time. And here's another example of the kinds of feelings. Again, most of these things are probably familiar to most of my audience here, but for teachers around the country, it is not. It is not something that's really known. And the regular workingman's ticket, you may have heard of that. It was a political party. It focused on laborers who were not Chinese, of course, and it was led mainly by Irish workers, Dennis Carney being the most notable of those, who was head of the regular workingmen's party and lobbied very strongly to keep Chinese from being able to join the unions, but also actively tried to work so that they would be cast out of the country. And of course, here in 1882, the Exclusion Act is passed. And if you wanted anything that's more blatant than just this quote here of "hip hurrah, the white man is on top of outright racism," I don't think you'll find it any better laid out than right there. So looking back in the past and trying to see its connections to the present and the notions of white supremacy, you see very much a connection and relevance that these feelings go way, way back and have been part of our history since the beginning. So we know that. We don't always know, and teachers don't always know that it applied to someone other than Blacks, but this is a good way of just trying to, again, lay that background in terms of what happens with the passage of the Exclusion Act in 1882. There's another area too. It's not always just history, but in government, and he's an historical figure. But I always like to focus on Senator Charles Hoare, who, prior to my affiliation with 1882 and learning about how we worked its way through into the United States Congress and through the resolutions that we got passed in the Senate and the House, that Senator Charles Hoare, a Republican from Massachusetts, and of course, remember the Republican Party then was, of course, the party of Lincoln, but he represents a very appropriate civics lesson. Not only does he dissent to the Exclusion Act in 1882, and actually there were many others who dissented at that particular time, but when the act came up for renewal in 1892, he was opposed to it again. And now there were fewer people who were opposed to the renewal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But once again in 1902, when it was approved in perpetuity, he remained the only senator to actually oppose that. So in all sorts of things, often I'm reminded of the book that we associate with John Kennedy when he was written as a senator, though it was ghostwritten for him by one of his speechwriters. But Profiles in Courage was one of the books that he was, or that Kennedy was known for. Charles Hoare was not mentioned as one of those, but he certainly should fit into a place of showing someone who dissented from what was otherwise a very, very popular decision, especially by 1902, to represent opposition to the Chinese Exclusion Act. One of the things that I failed to mention just here before, though, that is another aspect of it, rarely in the curriculum guides or in the textbooks is it mentioned that the Chinese Exclusion Act did more than just exclude Chinese from entering into the country. The other part of it, of course, was it denied citizenship for those people who were already here, for those Chinese who are already here. And that is so important when you think of it in other ways. In civic life, how is it you express your opinion? Through the ballot, through the vote. And if you don't have any vote, then you have really no political power. Nor do you even have power in the sense of being able to exercise some sense of authority or agency through other political beings who might see the Chinese American or later the Asian American vote as something they needed to direct some attention to. If you don't have the vote, why should I, as a politician, spend any time in your community to see if there's anything you really need? So denying them the vote denies them political agency and also the ability really to affect their lives, at least in a political way. Another civics lesson in that sense. there's another aspect that I think is really important. It's just come back to me in many, many ways. But Samuel Gompers is a monumental figure in the sense of American labor history. He's always included in the standards as a founder of the American Federation of Labor, a significant figure along with Eugene Debs and so many others, John Lewis, for being one of the founders, most important founders of the American labor movement. But as is true with so many figures in history, these are complicated individuals. And from an Asian American point of view, he has a particularly pernicious image of the Chinese. And this is a document here on the left that is entitled Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Coolieism, Which Shall Survive? So when we're speaking about the American labor movement, I mentioned Dennis Carney already before, but why not bring in this aspect of American labor history, which is so violently anti-Asian, anti-Chinese? So Samuel Gompers, if you look through this document, it's easy enough to get a hold of because it was distributed to all the senators, because in 1902, originally when it was published, it was meant to reinforce the notion that the exclusion acts needed to be kept in place, that there was no reason to lift those. So American labor lobbied very hard to keep Chinese out, with one exception. The International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, they were the one organization that chose not to scapegoat the Chinese. But in 1908, as in the aftermath of things like the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, and also just in that short time between 1902 and 1908, there were some significant numbers of Japanese who came to the United States, and they too began to be discriminated against. And Gompers wanted to make sure that he expressed his view as late as 1908 to make sure that the view of Chinese was expanded to a broader group of Asians. So it's, again, something where if we're talking about standards and you have to talk about American labor movements, that's important to do. Here's another example of, just on the right in the Boston Herald, over 300 Chinamen arrested in big roundup by police. This is from also that same time period, 1903. So that there's this active effort to round up Chinese, deport them, get them out of the country in ways that most often are not taught in our schools. So I think there's a particular kind of approach that we've taken in 1882 to make sure that we tell our story. One of the complexities, I know Charles and I have been talking about this with other groups as well. How do we particularly find our own niche in telling this story? There's a lot of material out there, but how do we come up with those things that are particularly relevant, relate to standards, and tell them in a particularly engaging way? So we want to make sure that we embed stories of Asian Americans into the core curriculum. So it's not just a question of looking necessarily for courses on Asian American studies. And we can get into that perhaps in the Q&A as we talk about that later. We want to make sure that the content is not just relevant, but important and deeply connected to American values and to the state standards as they're already written. How do we provoke and engage students, make them think differently about what they see? How do they look deeply into the text, raise questions, and challenge assumptions? How do we present information in a variety of ways and encourage students to convey ideas through writing, art, film, any way that communicates their ideas effectively? Again, a nice link to what Baldwin and Larissa were talking about, because we really want to make sure that students be able to express themselves in lots of different ways. So one thing that most teachers know, particularly in social studies classes, is that it helps using something that's provocative, gets them to think right away, that grabs their attention and ties the curriculum themes and context from their textbook into the particular niche history that we have maybe in our lesson plans. So let's take something like that. Why are Asian Americans so often seen as perpetual foreigners, unable to be considered real Americans? Well, that question raises another important one about what it means to be an American. And throughout the curriculum, at every grade level, and when you're talking about immigration, you're talking about the melting pot, that notion of what it means to be American is constantly changing. But I have a personal animosity towards that connection of the melting pot. and whether it really has any validity today's America as we talk about these kinds of things. Oops, let me go back, I think. Yeah. So taking a lesson and that we've developed at 1882 and looking where that ties in and the kind of things I'm talking about, finally, someone like Wam King Arp is getting a fair amount of attention because of the questions of citizenship. But there are other cases involving Asian Americans that are also very, very important. So this is one thing where we want to take a look at what that might mean. So very quickly going through Wong Kim Ark that I think most of you know about. He left the country. He was of course born here. That was the issue. And when he left, the document, the document that he, oh my goodness, what happened here? Okay. How did I do this? I may need somebody's help to figure out what I need to do here.
You can stop share screen just to see your screen once again.
There we go.
And then you'll see it on your screen. And then you could share once more.
Try clicking escape to exit full screen.
Try this again.
There you go.
Somehow I think I lost my slideshow. Let me try again here.
You want to see if we can pull it for you, Ray? It's in the Google Drive, I think. You want to pull it?
Okay, I can look for it.
Yeah. It's in the Google Drive under the Friday presentations. We'll pull it up for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just give us a minute to pull it up.
Melanie?
Uh-huh.
Maybe we could just take a moment to see if there's any questions that we have.
Yeah.
And then we could drop it in the chat or maybe ask that while Ray's pulling that up.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Let's see. What do we have here?
I think for me, I had one question because, you know, as an educator who's has a teaching credential, admin credential, and now teaching in the college system for Asian American Studies, what can we do in our local lodges with 1882 Foundation to kind of create that robust advocacy piece, but also to provide some resources for our local school districts if we are to further push the idea to incorporate Asian American histories alongside or within American history lessons?
That's a great question. Advocacy, of course, is I think the key there. And you know, one of the differences between East Coast and West Coast is you may have a better ability to draw on people, you know, in the community who are already teachers and in the education system than people who are here on the East Coast. And I'll maybe try to share that with people later too. But I know just recently here in Virginia, there was a student who was very upset with the fact that she learned very little Asian American history in her course. So she started a petition to see if that could be something that would be addressed in the state legislature through the Virginia General Assembly. And it's gotten a lot of quite a bit of traction, not just here in Virginia, but elsewhere. So that's, you know, one avenue. And so I think if, you know, local lodges and chapters of other Asian American affiliated organizations can promote those kinds of things, that would be really, really very helpful and important. So I think that's a key to see what we could do, you know, in that sense. In terms of resources, we at 1882 were trying to develop, along with OCA, a toolkit that would really highlight, I think, a lot of the materials are out there. One of the things we've discovered, of course, is that there are plenty of materials out there, but it's very difficult for a teacher to be able to just find and do that. So I think that's sort of the issue here. How do we make it accessible to teachers? How do you make it so they feel comfortable in a website and looking at a site rather, and knowing that the information is solid and trustworthy? Let me kind of give you a quick example of something that I think is important. Often in immigration, there are comparisons made between the experience of most Europeans coming through Ellis Island and then comparing that to the experience at Angel Island. And I can tell you that the Advanced Placement Board, they have lessons they put together for helping to teach about things in the advanced placement classes. The only thing that I ever saw there in terms of dealing with Asian Americans was this lesson that compared the Ellis Island experience to that of Angel Island. And it talked about particularly the Irish and the kinds of hardships they faced in coming into the country. And then it compared Asians, particularly the Chinese, coming in. But there was very little of the contrast. And as I think most of you know too, there was a world of difference between what was happening to European immigrants on Ellis Island and what was happening to Asian Americans coming in through Angel Island. And the simplest way to put it is the actions on the East Coast was basically one of welcoming immigrants. Yes, you had to go through screening and disease and some of these other kind of things that were there, so it wasn't necessarily all that easy, but the vast majority of immigrants were able to come in, very few questions asked. On the West Coast, on the other hand, coming in through Angel Island, it really was a policy of exclusion. And that, I think, has to be made really abundantly clear. So if you're talking about advanced placement and you're talking about kids who are really at the top of their class, generally speaking, even though there's an effort to democratize the AP system and make it more open to everybody, there really is a question of that there.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I think we're back. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. And I'll just, if you move on to the next slide, please, that would be great. Yeah, what I was going to say here is that one document on the left is the affidavit that Wong Kim Ark had to sign, or have signed rather. And if you move to the next slide, there are 3 signatures there on the lower right-hand part of white folks that had to attest to the truth of what it was Wong Kim Ark was saying. So when he left the country, it wasn't good enough to say just have 3 other Chinese who were citizens of the United States attest to his Americanness, but it actually had to be 3 white witnesses. So people who are of African-American descent can identify very easily with this because that, of course, was part of their history as well. Next slide. So I'm, yes, beginning to get aware of some concern here with time, but here's a picture of a slide from an Oriental public school. It was labeled in 1914 in California. But I think one thing that people who know the Mamie Tate case in 1888, she won a case against the state of California, or no, not against the state of California. It was against the city of San Francisco that said she could not attend the San Francisco public schools. So in 1888, that was actually the law in California. The city of San Francisco bypassed that by creating what it called then the School for Chinese and Mongolian Children, I believe it was called. But when we roll around to 1896, and go ahead and I think slow the next slide here. Oh no, I'm sorry. Go back for a second here, yeah. We'll refer back to this here as well. But the case comes up later when we're talking about Plessy versus Ferguson that passes in that is ruled on in 1896 that establishes separate but equal. Next slide now. So Bhagat Singh Thind really raises questions of citizenship as well. And I like to use this slide when I'm showing it with kids just on its own, that is just using the picture that you see here of Bhagat Singh Thind, and you ask kids, what do they see here? And rarely does anyone identify student or teacher this as an American soldier. But in fact, that's what it is. He enlisted in the Army in 1918. He tried to become an American citizen after the war, and he was denied. He challenged that ruling and lost at the US Supreme Court in 1923. There's a very similar case involving a Japanese American of a guy named Ozawa, who also tried to do much the same thing. Next slide. Gong Lum versus Rice in 1927. Many of you are familiar with this case, but if we're talking about civil rights, if we're talking about Brown versus Board of Education, and had it ever been challenged before, here's where we can bring it up. So in 1927, the Lums sought to have their children attend school in Rosedale, Mississippi. They'd actually been able to go through elementary school with no problem. But when they came to a consolidated school that was established a year or so before, they were denied. Well, they actually went to school, but then they were sent home after at noontime, at lunchtime, because it was meant to be only for whites. It was the first challenge to the doctrine of separate but equal. And in this case, they were denied. One of the ironies, and this came to light to me just in reading a review of a book about Justice John Harlan, he was famous in 1896 for Plessy versus Ferguson for using the colorblind argument that justice should be colorblind, the Constitution should be colorblind. And he was the only dissenting voice back in 1896 about separate but equal. In 1898, in Wong Kim Ark, one of the ironies was that he actually dissented again in the case that Wong Kim Ark won about being an American citizen, arguing that the quote from him here is, "There is a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens." And he was referring to the Chinese. Again, history is complicated. Justice Harlan is complicated. Samuel Gompers is complicated. All these figures are ways in which the questions of where do we tie this into the curriculum, it's actually very easy to do. Next slide. There's another way of looking at this, and the connection to immigration is the obvious one that we have looked at many ways, but in more recent history, the 1965 Hart-Celler Act is the one that has done most to change the complexion of the United States in very literal terms. And if we look at the census results from this most recent census, a lot of the news in the last day or so has been about that. You can see a lot of that. This particular photo makes a lot of sense to me because I was finishing up high school around that particular time. You see the backdrop of New York City from Liberty Island, and there are a lot of figures that I know in here that many of you may be able to identify as well. In this era where we find little bipartisanship, it's interesting to note when we're talking about immigration history, how popular really this was to change the law in 1965. And as you may know, this is the one that got rid of the quotas that have been dating back to the 1920s. Next slide. All right, here's another slide that really is a lesson unto itself. Who is this woman? I hope that many of this particular audience might recognize this woman. And if you want to take a few seconds just to put her name in the chat, that might be helpful, and that we could see maybe what's going on here. I'd like to see if anybody knows. And the dating of this is also 1965. But this is Patsy Mink, Congresswoman from Hawaii. And she's often mentioned just in the simple context of she was the first person of color, or often the first Asian, as mentioned, in the United States Congress, elected in the fall of 1964. And this picture that shows her here is of the other incoming members of the freshman class of 1965 into Congress. So if you want kids to interpret a photograph and see what the meaning is behind it, this is one way to do it. What's really kind of fascinating about this, though, is that if you look at what is going on in the political landscape, it's very easy to kind of maybe forget that she played a very important role in a number of pieces of legislation. Her main field was interest in education. So she served on the education committees in the House, And the legislation that is most associated with her is that she was a co-sponsor of Title IX. And that is something that is taught in the standards and must be included. So it's not just a question of introducing a factoid about Patsy Mink and saying that she is worthy of recognition because she was the first person of color. But if you're talking about massive social changes and things that are important to how society has evolved over the time in the 1960s and 1970s, it would be difficult to not to mention Patsy Mink in terms of Title IX and other aspects of education law and specifically. So for special education, she has a special place also to be recognized. Next slide. And the mid-60s is another time where we're really talking about civil rights and the identification of Asian Americans who see themselves as Asian Americans, no longer just Chinese Americans, but there's a big difference going on here now with Japanese Americans. This particular slide, taken from the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center, shows Japanese American internees or people who are incarcerated working in the fields during their incarceration. This is at Tule Lake incarceration camp. And that's another important aspect of the life that is being shown here. Next. And then there are all sorts of other ways to mention content in very important ways. So if you're looking, for example, at labor, another issue dealing with labor and the farm worker strikes of the 1960s, most people will recognize Cesar Chavez in the upper right. He's the guy on the left. And I don't know of any standards thing that doesn't mention him when it comes to looking at labor history and getting the Mexican Americans to be recognized in the work that they do. But most people do not know that the strike was actually started by Larry Leong, the figure to his right. And that gentleman was a Filipino American who actually started the strike and tried to convince Cesar Chavez to come along. And Cesar Chavez, the pressure was on him actually use his workers as strike breakers. So there's an aspect here that's very important to understand what eventually came to be seen as solidarity between them, but also Larry Leong's role is often forgotten in that. Grace Lee Boggs is another important figure, particularly when it comes to speaking out for civil rights throughout a long, long history, fair housing, environmental justice. And then the other figure here, Yuri Kochiyama, is also very important in the 1980s when the Japanese American community was lobbying very hard for recognition of the wrongs that were done in the Japanese American incarceration activities that were going on then. Next. Another area of solidarity, and I'm going to try to run through these last few really quickly, but trying to see too that the experience of Asian Americans isn't tied just to that experience of Asian Americans solely, but it has connections to life going on everywhere. So in Chinatown in DC, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, that had a direct impact on the life of Chinatown there because it was right on the edge of Chinatown. Next. And we see here in a series of slides some of the obvious kind of connections there in which way so we can see a little bit of what I was talking about before of trying to tie that Asian American awareness growing in and tying to the African American experience. Next. As well too, one of the things that I think we are learning now too is the Vietnam War is always taught through the lens of Americans' connection to the Vietnam War. Not that that's bad, but there are other ways that in which the story can be told. Next. And this is another aspect of that. Of course, the Vietnam War led to Lyndon Johnson deciding he wouldn't run, Robert Kennedy getting involved in the race. Next. But the Vietnam War Memorial, as many of you know, its design was highly controversial back in the 1970s when it was first proposed. But why not start the story there and introduce Maya Lin, another voice that really comes through the art world in a way in which we can tell the story of the Vietnam War, but not necessarily in the traditional way of how chronologically it's often taught, But what are these images? What does it mean? And what does it mean to have a Chinese American design it and have it recognized? It's a different way of approaching the story and maybe getting voices that are not usually heard mentioned in the first place. Next. Also, there are ways of connecting the story of Vincent Chin in lots of different ways. It's not just a question of the connection to violence and this long history of violence that I kind of started this slideshow with in many cases, but how do we address some of that? So I think this is where probably a good idea just to stop. There's some other slides here. And I know we don't really have much in the way of time for a question, but maybe we can take one quick one.
Hi, King Yi, I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. When you design a lesson plan or maybe a lesson telling the AAPI story, and you know that your audience, your students will be predominantly white. So do you use a different approach, or, the question really is, does the approach really depends on what the audience will be?
My argument would be no. That I think, and the whole point of a lot of what I'm saying is this stuff really ties in so closely, with it. So if you're talking about economic changes, that just look at the last slide, that are taking place in the 1980s in the United States, and talking about different kinds of social issues that are important in the 1980s. Well, talking about the changes in the auto industry. How is it we went from having all General Motors and Ford cars in the 1980s to suddenly seeing this rise of Toyota and Honda and Nissan and all these other companies that we now know are, some familiar to us. That's a way of also looking at and bringing into the story of Vincent Chin. Yes, he was Chinese American, but he was murdered because the people who murdered him thought he was Japanese. Mm-hmm. And this is another way of just looking at the kind of contextual thing here. It doesn't matter who your audience is and who you're trying to teach to. These are just things in which the story can be broadened to really tell a broader Asian American story.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
Charles, I have a question.
Yes.
I think it's very important, this discussion, and I know that we have a very proud history, but with all of the anti-Asian hate and what's going on, what if you go to the school board and whatever, and they say that we are trying to rewrite the history that has been taught, and they're going to throw up in our face the critical race theory issue? How do you address that, Ting Yi?
Just as a way of background, someone asked me for the first time, if I knew what critical race theory was about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. And all I could say to that person was, I've heard of it, but I really don't have a clue as to what it's about. My point in, I think, trying to address a lot of these things here is, and that's why I've tried to lay out the emphasis right from the beginning, that we have standards and we can teach to standards and bring in Asian American content that really fits in. You don't have to make a point about trying to say, oh, you know what, we're missing all this stuff that's in the history. You can, especially when it comes to professional development, help teachers understand that this is stuff that really can be included without making any kind of stretch to say, oh, I want to bring in different voices. You're bringing in different voices because that's American history. This is what it's all about. Yes, you're hearing about Asian American voices maybe for the first time, but it's not to say that these voices haven't been there all along. We're just uncovering them. We're removing the invisibility from it. We're uncovering the hidden aspect of it. So unfortunately, that term critical race theory has been so much bandied about lately. Frankly, I would try to avoid it as much as possible.
I want to thank you. We're actually at time, a little bit over time, but that was a really fascinating presentation discussion, and just looking at the different ways to get the information into the schools. And these are things that I don't think we always think about. So I want to thank you very much for joining us today in the presentation, and we hope to see you again, and maybe for a more in-depth presentation. I think we just barely touched the tip of the iceberg. So I think there's a lot for all of us to learn. And but I'd like to encourage everybody to go out there and kind of think about what we can do to get the information out. We need to move on to our next presentation. And it will be a different Zoom link. So I will be closing this Zoom presentation and hope to see everyone at the next one. Thank you.
Before we go, I'd just like to thank Jing Yi for spending the time with us today. Thank you very much, Jing Yi.